Imagine a medieval monk, right? He's sitting in this damp, candlelit room.
Probably freezing.
Oh, definitely freezing. And he's taking a sharp blade to a heavy piece of parchment. But, like, he isn't making a mistake. He is intentionally scraping away words that have just been sitting there for centuries.
Yeah.
Why? Because, well, those words told the peasants outside his walls that they didn't actually need him. Welcome to our deep dive for today.
It is a wild visual to start with.
Right. And we are looking at a really fascinating stack of sources today. Specifically, we've got excerpts from the suppressed chapters of Daniel and the uncensored Chronicles of Daniel. And these sources make an incredibly bold claim about one of the most famous texts in human history.
Yeah, the premise these sources present is that the book of Daniel, at least as it appears in most standard Western Bibles today, is a heavily censored, watered-down version of its original self.
Wow.
The argument they're making is that European monks and political councils systematically erased entire chapters to hide, explosive truths that directly threaten their institutional power.
And if you're listening to this right now, you might be thinking, uh-oh, we're stepping on some serious religious landmines today.
Definitely a sensitive topic.
So let's just set the ground rules right up front. We aren't here to declare what's holy and what's not.
Right.
And we definitely aren't taking sides on millennial theological debates. Our mission today is purely to impartially report on the evidence sitting on the desk between us. We're just putting these claims under the microscope to understand the exact arguments contained in the material you've brought to us.
Exactly. The goal here is to dissect the anatomy of this alleged cover-up. Like, what specific narratives do these sources say were hidden? And more importantly, what is their rationale for why an institution would feel so threatened that they'd literally take a knife to a sacred text?
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the supposed suppressed chapters, we first have to understand the scale of what the sources call a massive canon clash.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a stark battle of numbers here, 66 versus 88.
Right, so those numbers refer to the total books included in the Bible. The sources draw a very sharp contrast between the standard Western Protestant Bible, which has been, well, in their view, aggressively trimmed down to 66 books, and a much larger, much older, and fiercely protected tradition.
And this older tradition wasn't just, sitting in a Vatican vault somewhere in Europe gathering dust.
No, not at all.
It was preserved in a completely different geographical and cultural context.
That is a crucial piece of the puzzle here. The sources point us directly to the ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church.
Tewahedo.
Right. Now, for some context, Tewahedo is a Ge'ez word, and it basically means unified or being made one.
Okay.
And that refers to their specific theology about the nature of Christ. But practically speaking, the thing that unified them was their profound isolation.
Ah, I see.
Because this community was historically shielded by these rugged, almost impenetrable mountains of East Africa. They were entirely cut off from the Roman Empire. Yeah, and completely cut off from all the subsequent European church councils that, spent centuries debating and editing the Western canon.
So while all these European committees were, voting on what got to stay and what had to go, this isolated community up in the mountains just simply kept the original massive library intact.
Exactly. A continuous, unbroken chain of 88 books.
Unbelievable.
And according to our sources, those missing 22 books in the West weren't just lost to time. They weren't misplaced. They were deliberately filtered out. If we connect this to the bigger picture, controlling a canon is arguably the ultimate tool for maintaining societal authority.
Oh, for sure.
When a centralized institution decides what is officially considered sacred scripture, they aren't just curating a reading list. They are dictating the absolute boundaries of acceptable human thought.
They define reality.
Exactly. They define reality.
Yeah.
If a text challenges the necessity of the institution itself, or, if it provides a blueprint for the common person to question authority, the institution has a massive vested interest in declaring that text apocryphal.
Apocryphal. People throw that word around a lot when talking about old texts, but in this context, it's essentially just a theological way of saying fake news or unauthorized.
So that is a highly accurate way to look at it, actually. Yeah. Labeling something apocryphal strips it of its divine authority.
Right.
It tells the reader, hey, you can read this as historical fiction if you want, but do not base your life or your rebellion on it.
It's like discovering a director's cut of a movie you've watched your entire life.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Say you've always watched a version where the conflict is just this vague battle against an abstract, distant evil. But then you see the director's cut, and it completely shifts the focus.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the story is about the corruption of the very people who are supposed to be the heroes, like the people actually running the society.
Yes.
When you realize the institutions were actively trying to protect their own local authority, the removal of specific stories starts to make a lot of logical sense. Take the local judges, for instance.
The story of Susanna is the perfect starting point for this, because it shifts the narrative focus from grand cosmic battles down to very human, very localized corruption.
Right.
The sources point to this specific chapter as the first major casualty of institutional censorship.
And in this text, which again, you won't find in most modern Western Bibles, Susanna is described as a beautiful, highly righteous woman.
Mm-hmm.
But she becomes the target of a pair of corrupt community elders. And the key detail here, the thing that stands out, is that these aren't just random thugs in an alleyway.
No, not at all.
These are men who hold significant formal religious and legal authority over the community.
They are the arbiters of the law, and they abuse that specific religious authority to corner her and attempt to manipulate her into a sexual encounter.
It's awful.
It is. And when she bravely refuses to comply with their abuse, they weaponize their power. They publicly falsely accuse her of the very crime they were trying to commit.
It is genuinely terrifying to read, because you realize the system is entirely rigged against her.
Completely.
She isn't just facing a bad rumor, she is being led away to face the death penalty. And it's all based entirely on the unquestioned testimony of these religious leaders.
Because of who they are.
Exactly. The community just assumes the leaders are telling the truth because of their title. But then, right at the last possible moment, the Holy Spirit raises up a young Daniel.
Yeah.
He steps right into the chaotic crowd, separates the two elders, cross-examines them, exposes their contradictory lies, and saves her innocent blood.
And the sources are very explicit about why they believe this particular story was buried by later institutions.
Okay.
They argue that Susanna's ordeal serves as a blazing, unforgettable warning that those in the absolute highest positions of local religious power can be profoundly, dangerously corrupt. Furthermore, it demonstrates that God's true justice often has to operate completely outside of and in direct opposition to rigged institutional systems.
Okay. I have to push back on the sources logic here a little bit.
Sure.
Because the standard 66-book Bible already has plenty of stories of deeply flawed leaders. I mean, look at King David and Bathsheba, or how the Pharisees are depicted later on.
Tons of them.
There are tons of corrupt kings and bad priests. So why do our sources claim this specific story of Susanna crossed the line for the institutional censors? What makes her story uniquely dangerous?
That is a critical distinction to make, and it really comes down to the proximity of the threat.
Proximity.
Yes. A story about a corrupt king from 3 centuries past, well, that's a safe historical lesson.
Sure.
And a story about the Pharisees is a theological debate. But the elders in the story of Susanna represent the local day-to-day religious authorities enforcing the law on the ground level.
Oh, I see.
They are the judges. They're the mediators of community morality.
Mm-hmm.
By depicting these specific everyday figures as predators who use the holy law to commit literal murder, the text directly undermines the daily authority of the local priesthood.
Okay. So it's not just, kings in distant castles can be bad. It's the guy handing down sentences in your village right now, the guy you were supposed to trust with your life. He might be manipulating the system for his own gain.
Exactly. The sources argue that institutional censors just couldn't tolerate a text that fundamentally encouraged everyday believers to distrust their local religious judges.
Right.
It creates a populace that questions every single ruling.
That is definitely a more immediate, localized threat to an institution's stability.
Yeah.
And if Susanna exposes corrupt individuals abusing the system, well, the next suppressed chapter we looked at takes a sledgehammer to the system itself.
Yes, the narrative of Bel and the Dragon escalates the stakes exponentially.
It really does.
It moves from exposing hypocritical individuals to exposing the fraudulent mechanics and, really, the economic extraction of the religious institution as a whole.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this story isn't just a theological debate. It reads like an ancient thriller.
It does.
The Babylonians revered this massive idol named Bel. And the priests of Bel had an incredibly lucrative gig going. Every single day, they demanded staggering offerings from the people. We're talking fine flour, 40 sheep, and 6 vessels of wine.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And they claimed that the idol of Bel was physically consuming all of this food overnight.
We need to pause and just look at the sheer scale of that for a second.
Yeah.
40 sheep a day is an industrial level of continuous sacrifice. That represents a massive, crippling extraction of wealth and resources from the general population.
Totally.
In the ancient world, controlling the food supply and a temple economy equated to absolute political power. The entire society's wealth was being funneled into this temple, all justified by the claim that the deity required it to survive.
Wait, so they were essentially running an ancient protection racket disguised as a divine mandate.
Pretty much.
So Daniel must have looked at this and realized the math didn't add up. So he sets a trap. He scatters ashes all over the temple floor, locks the doors with the king's seal, and just waits. The next morning, the food is gone, but Daniel points out the footprints in the ash. He exposes the truth to the king. The priests and their extended families were sneaking in through secret doors underneath the altar and eating the offerings themselves.
So bold.
It's the ultimate ancient, high-stakes Scooby-Doo unmasking. He proves the terrifying god is just an elaborate front for greedy guys in masks hoarding the nation's wealth.
What's fascinating here is how the sources interpret this action. They don't just see it as a clever detective trick.
Right.
They describe this chapter as a literal blueprint for dismantling fake religious authority. It's a text designed to aggressively empower the individual to look behind the curtain.
And Daniel doesn't just stop at the idol of Bel. In the very same chapter, there's another target. The Babylonians have a revered living dragon that they worship.
Yes.
But I'm honestly hung up on the logistics of this next part. The source says Daniel doesn't use a sword. He mixes up pitch, fat, and hair, boils it all together, and feeds it to the dragon.
Yeah.
The text literally says the beast burst in sunder. I mean, mechanically, how does the source even rationalize that working? Or is the source arguing this is meant to be read as a metaphor for destroying the fuel of fake religions?
It's a great question. And, while some historical scholars do debate the biochemical possibility of expanding pitch and fat in a reptile's stomach.
Which sounds awful, by the way.
Very, very awful. But the sources we are analyzing focus entirely on the psychological and metaphorical impact.
Okay.
Whether it's literal or symbolic, the mechanism is the same, taking mundane, gross elements like pitch, fat, hair, and using them to violently dismantle an object of divine terror.
Right.
He blows up the dragon to prove to the people definitively that their fears are misplaced and their gods are mortal.
The psychological impact of watching your untouchable god explode because some guy fed it tar has to be profound.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is exactly why an entrenched religious institution might want to make sure that story accidentally, falls out of the official binder.
Yes, exactly.
If you rely on the blind compliance and financial offerings of the people, you absolutely do not hand them a blueprint for unmasking spiritual fraud.
Because if Daniel can prove the Babylonian priesthood is an economic scam, well, the reader might start asking some really uncomfortable questions about where their own daily offerings are really going.
And that realization strips away everything. If you dismantle the corrupt local judges, like in the Story of Susanna, and you dismantle the fraudulent priesthood and the entire temple economy, as in Bel and the dragon, what is left for the everyday believer? You've destroyed the entire institutional structure.
That brings us to the theological core of these suppressed texts, the prayer of Azariah. Because if the previous chapters tear down the false structures, Azariah provides the alternative, and it is deeply mystical.
Right, so we are talking about Azariah and his companions being thrown into a blazing furnace by the Babylonian king for refusing to worship a golden image.
Yes.
But the key detail here isn't just that they survive. The text says they are walking right in the midst of the roaring fire.
And to pay attention to what they're doing while walking in those flames, they aren't screaming for a priest to save them.
Right.
They are directly praising and blessing God. The text gives us this specific, incredibly powerful quote from the absolute heart of the fire. Azariah cries out, "Blessed art thou, O Lord God of our fathers. Thy name is worthy to be praised and glorified forevermore."
It's an incredible image.
It is.
The sources argue that the profound message here is about direct access. In the absolute darkest, most terrifying, literally burning trials of life, believers have direct, unmediated access to the divine.
Yes, unmediated.
You don't need to go to a priest. You don't need to bring a sheep to a temple. You don't need a massive, wealthy institution to translate your prayers or mediate your salvation. Because God's presence is right there in the fire with you.
This raises an important question.
What's that?
How does an institution maintain control over a population that truly believes they have direct, unmediated access to the divine?
Hmm.
Historically, the answer is they can't. Not easily, anyway. Against a backdrop of rigid hierarchical control, the concept of unmediated faith is fundamentally revolutionary. It renders the entire bureaucracy completely obsolete.
So the sources are essentially arguing that Western councils marginalized this chapter specifically because it cuts out the institutional middleman.
That is the absolute core of their argument. The sources claim that these councils needed to maintain a compliant population that was fundamentally dependent on the church's structural hierarchy for salvation, for forgiveness, and for connection to God. A spiritually empowered people who know they can access deliverance directly and who possess texts that encourage them to challenge corrupt leaders are nearly impossible to subjugate.
Wow.
Therefore, the deeply mystical, highly personal, and structurally bypassing prayer of Azariah simply had to go.
It's an incredibly compelling narrative. We've got isolated mountain monks preserving ancient truths, corrupt elders facing justice, exploding dragons, and a secret, centuries-long history of censorship.
It's got everything.
But as we zoom out from the ancient world and look at the actual physical sources providing this information to us today, things take a very distinct modern twist.
They do. It is vital to analyze not just the historical claims contained in the sources, but their modern-day intent.
Right.
We have to ask, why was this specific compilation written and distributed today? And what specific action does it want you, the reader, to take?
So what does this all mean? Well, as we read through to the very end of our source material, it becomes glaringly obvious that the documents are actively promoting a newly published collection of these exact erased chapters.
Yeah, there's a pivot.
Right. The sources direct the reader to a modern publisher called Echelon Nexus Press, which has recently released a project they call the Ethiopian Canon Library.
And they are highly specific with their calls to action here. They point the audience directly to Volume 2B, Unique Ethiopian Old Testament Books, which they helpfully note contains the complete uncensored texts of Azariah, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon.
And they don't stop there. They also strongly recommend grabbing Volume 7, Comprehensive Study Guide to the Unique Ethiopian Books to help you, decode the history.
Right.
And they direct everyone to a specific landing page, BibleDetails.com/start, to purchase and access the library. Wait a second. So after this massive, sweeping historical mystery about protecting the truth from greedy institutions, our sources are actually just an extended marketing funnel for a book series.
It is undeniably promotional material. However, we must apply our impartiality check right here. While the sources are clearly structured as a marketing campaign for Echelon Nexus Press, the texts they reference and the broader historical reality of the 88-book Ethiopian canon are legitimate subjects of scholarly study.
Okay, that's fair.
The fact that someone is selling a book about these excluded chapters doesn't negate the historical reality that these chapters were, in fact, excluded from the Protestant Bible.
So the texts themselves, Susanna, the dragon, the furnace, those are real ancient texts that have been debated by scholars and theologians for centuries.
Exactly.
The marketing funnel is just the modern vehicle delivering them to our attention today. But let's look at the mechanics of that marketing because it's fascinating.
It's a masterclass in modern consumer psychology, honestly.
Really?
Yeah. This pitch relies entirely on a modern audience's inherent, culturally deeply ingrained distrust of massive historical institutions. We are living in an era of a profound trust crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
By positioning the act of buying this book as an act of uncovering hidden truth, the publisher is weaponizing that gap in trust. They are selling secret knowledge, elevating the simple act of purchasing a book into a rebellion against long-dead censors.
It's brilliant, honestly. They hid this from you. Buy Volume 2B to reclaim your power.
Yep.
It taps perfectly into that feeling we talked about at the very beginning. That visceral reaction to finding out the story you've been told your whole life is missing its most dangerous pages.
It's a powerful psychological hook that makes the reader feel like an insider.
So let's recap the journey we've been on today. We started with the grand numerical contrast between the trimmed-down 66-book Western canon and the massive, unbroken 88-book library preserved by the isolation of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Right.
We looked at how our sources claim Western councils actively filtered out texts that threaten their monopoly on power.
We then examined the specific nature of those threats, the anti-corruption themes, and the exposure of predatory local legal leadership in the Story of Susanna.
followed by the literal unmasking of the temple economy, the exposure of the priesthood's massive wealth extraction, and the destruction of the fake idol in Bel and the Dragon.
And we arrived at the theological core with the prayer of Azariah, which champions unmediated faith and direct access to the divine, completely bypassing the need for institutional structures.
All wrapping up with the realization that our sources are bringing this alleged institutional cover-up to light today as part of a highly targeted mission to promote the newly published Ethiopian Canon Library by Echelon Nexus Press. It's a massive amount of historical and psychological material to process.
It is, and it leaves us with something profound to consider that stretches far beyond ancient Babylon or medieval Europe.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about today's digital age. If monks with ink and parchment could edit a civilization's worldview for a millennium by simply cutting out a few chapters, what happens when modern invisible algorithms decide which chapters of our daily news get quietly pushed to the bottom of the feed? Are we living in a trimmed-down canon right now, completely unaware of what's been left in the box?
That is exactly the kind of question we love to leave you with. Next time you scroll through your feed or pick up a widely accepted history book, maybe ask yourself who decided what made it onto the page and who benefits from what they left out. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.